The moment I walked into that conference room, every head turned, and not one of them looked at the man sitting alone at the far end of the table. I almost missed him entirely. He was tucked into a corner near the windows, away from the cluster of suits and name badges, and the kind of confident small talk that fills rooms like that. The quarterly fundraising luncheon for Hargrove Medical Center in Minneapolis was the most well-attended healthcare philanthropy event in the state. Board members, hospital executives, city councilors, even a senator who'd flown in from Washington. And I was just Adrian Kowalski, a 26-year-old physical therapy aide who'd been volunteered for floor staff duty by my supervisor because 2 of our regular event team had called in sick that morning. I needed the overtime. My younger sister Lily had been accepted into nursing school at the University of Minnesota, and our mom had been working double shifts at the grocery store for 3 years trying to keep us both afloat. I wasn't in a position to say no to anything that came with extra pay, so there I was in a rented vest that was a size too small, carrying a tray of sparkling water, trying to remember which tables were assigned to which caterers. That's when I noticed him. If you believe in seeing people for who they really are, not for what they can or can't do, not for what they look like, but for the human being underneath all of it, take a second right now to like this video. Leave a comment letting me know where you're watching, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. Stories like this one matter. I really do believe that. His name, I would learn later, was Elliot Foresight. He was 31 years old, the only son of Raymond Foresight, the founder and CEO of Foresight Bio Group, one of the largest medical device manufacturers in the Midwest. Raymond Foresight had donated more to Hargrove Medical Center over the past decade than any other private contributor in the hospital's history. His name was on the children's wing. His name was on 2 research labs. His name was on plaque near the front entrance that nobody reads, but everybody walks past. And his son was sitting completely alone in a room full of people who all knew exactly who he was. Elliot had a spinal cord injury. He'd been in a power wheelchair for 3 years following a rock climbing accident in Colorado. From what I later pieced together, the accident happened on a route he'd done a dozen times before, a scramble up the north face of a trail near Estes Park, something he did every spring. A handhold gave way. He fell 18 feet onto a ledge below. The injury was at the T6 vertebra, which meant he had full use of his arms and hands but nothing below his chest. He was an emergency room physician before the accident. He had been one of the fastest-moving, highest-rated attending doctors at a trauma center in Denver. After the fall, he couldn't return to the ER, not because of his mind was completely intact, but because the physical demands of emergency medicine made it impossible. He'd spent 2 years trying to find a way back in, consulting on cases remotely, teaching part-time at a medical school. He'd moved back to Minneapolis to be closer to his father. He hadn't attended a public event in almost 8 months. I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was what I could see. I could see that when the event coordinator had greeted the room, she'd made eye contact with nearly every person except him. I could see that when the reception mingling began and clusters of people formed naturally across the room, the cluster nearest to Elliot somehow always drifted a few degrees away from where he was positioned. Not cruelly. Nobody was rude about it. It was more like the social geometry of the room quietly rearranged itself to leave that corner empty. I watched a hospital administrator approach him once. They shook hands, exchanged maybe 4 sentences, and then the administrator's eyes caught someone across the room and he excused himself, and Elliot was alone again. There's a specific kind of loneliness in being surrounded by people who all know your last name. I recognized it because I'd seen it on my sister's face when she'd gone through a hard stretch in high school, present in the room, invisible in the room, both at the same time. It's worse somehow than just being alone. At least when you're alone, it's honest. My job was to refill water glasses and stay out of the way of the actual staff. I was not supposed to be socializing with guests. My supervisor, Graham, and I mean this kindly because Graham is actually a decent person, had been very clear about that. I refilled 2 glasses on the far side of the room. I made my way along the windows. And then I was standing about 6 feet from Elliot Foresight, and he glanced up at me the way people glance up at waitstaff, not dismissively, just briefly, and then looked back out the window at the parking garage across the street. Something about that look stopped me. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was closer to resignation. The look of someone who had made peace with a thing they hadn't chosen to make peace with. There's a difference between acceptance and exhaustion, and what I saw in his face was the latter wearing the mask of the former. I set my tray down on the small side table near him without fully deciding to do it. "The view's better on the other side of the building," I said. "The river." He blinked at me, like he was recalibrating, like he was trying to figure out if I'd actually said something or if he'd imagined it. "The Mississippi," he said. "Yeah, I did a shift here 3 weeks ago and spent my whole break just looking at it from the 4th floor. The way the light hits it in the afternoon is kind of ridiculous." He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile yet, but the possibility of one. "You work here regularly?" "I work for a PT clinic about a mile from here. We get contracted out for hospital events sometimes." I nodded at my ill-fitting vest. "I'm clearly the picture of professionalism." That got a small laugh out of him. A real one. Not the polished social laugh people use in rooms like that. A genuine one, quick and a little surprised, like it had escaped before he could decide whether to allow it. His name was Elliot. He told me that first. Not his last name. We talked for maybe 12 minutes. I know because I was tracking time anxiously, watching for my supervisor's eyeline. We talked about the river. We talked about Minneapolis winters, which were brutal that year. We'd had back-to-back storms in February that shut the city down for 3 days. He told me he'd grown up in Adina and had moved back after a few years in Denver. He asked what the PT clinic specialized in, and I told him spinal rehab, post-surgical orthopedic cases, some neurological work. He nodded in a way that told me that wasn't a coincidence for him. I didn't ask about the wheelchair. He didn't bring up his father. We just talked. I noticed Raymond Foresight watching from across the room before Elliot did. Raymond was a tall man in his early 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of controlled stillness that powerful people often develop. Not cold exactly, but calibrated. He was watching our conversation with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not anger, not warmth. Something careful and assessing in between. I picked my tray back up when one of the catering leads gave me a pointed look from across the room. I told Elliot it was good to meet him. He said the same, and then he said something I wasn't expecting. He said, "Thank you for stopping." Just that, nothing more elaborate. But the way he said it, like it was something that had required courage to say, like he wasn't sure he should say it, but had decided to anyway, I carried that with me for the rest of the afternoon. I thought that was the end of it. I was back at the clinic by 4 o'clock, changed out of the borrowed vest, charting notes on a patient's knee flexion progress. I'd mostly talked myself out of thinking about the fundraiser by the time I locked up and headed to the bus stop. My supervisor called me the following Tuesday morning before my shift started. He told me that Raymond Forsyth had reached out to the clinic's director. Raymond had been at the luncheon. He'd watched what happened, or more precisely, what hadn't happened, which was that his son had spent the entire event alone, and that I was the only person in a room of 200 who had actually stopped and talked to him like he was just a person. Raymond had asked for my name. He'd asked if there was a way to contact me directly. My first thought, honestly, was that I'd done something wrong, that standing there and talking to a donor's family member was some kind of protocol violation, and I was about to get a very uncomfortable phone call. My supervisor told me to call Raymond Forsyth back at my convenience. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 15 minutes, trying to figure out what I was walking into. Raymond answered on the second ring. His voice was measured, professional, but there was something underneath it that I recognized. The specific register of a parent who is worried about their child and trying not to show how worried they are. He thanked me for what I'd done. I told him I hadn't done anything. I'd just talked to his son. He said quietly, that sometimes that's everything. He told me that Elliot had come home from the luncheon and called him that evening. He said Elliot had laughed for the first time in months. He said Elliot had mentioned the river and the vest, and the conversation had mentioned it in detail, which wasn't something Elliot had done about anything in a very long time. Raymond asked me if I would be willing to meet with him. We met 3 days later at a coffee shop near Nicollet Mall downtown. He was more informal than I expected. No entourage, no assistant, just a man in a fleece jacket with his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. He was direct. He told me that Elliot had been struggling, that the injury had taken not just his mobility but his profession, his sense of forward motion, his identity in a way that 2 years of therapy and support and every resource Raymond could offer hadn't managed to touch. He said Elliot was intellectually sharp and emotionally functional and completely shut down at the same time, which was somehow harder to address than any of the things that had visible solutions. He didn't ask me to do anything specific. He asked if I'd be open to meeting Elliot again, in a casual setting, no pressure, no agenda, just to see if the connection was real or if the luncheon had been a fluke. I told him I'd think about it. I went home and called my sister Lily and told her everything. Lily had a gift for cutting through noise. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and then she said, "Adrian, you talked to a guy and he laughed. That's not a fluke, that's just you." I texted Raymond the next morning. Elliot and I got coffee the following week at a place on Washington Avenue that had those big roll-up garage doors that open onto the sidewalk in warm weather. It was still too cold to open them, but the light came through the glass and it felt spacious in a way I liked. I arrived first and immediately second-guessed the table height, too low for easy wheelchair access, and relocated to a high top near the window that had more clearance. Then second-guessed that too, because the stools would be at an awkward height differential, and I was standing there staring at furniture like it had personally offended me when Elliot came through the door and said, "You're calculating the geometry, aren't you?" I laughed and said yes, and he said he appreciated it, but the original table was fine, and he had a standing rule against friends rearranging spaces for him, without being asked friends. He said it lightly, offhandedly, like it was already the thing we were, and I noticed that. We talked for 2 hours. We talked about medicine and physical therapy, and what it actually feels like to go from being a highly kinetic, on-your-feet for 12 hours professional, to navigating a world that hadn't been designed with your body in mind. He talked about it directly, without self-pity, and without the careful PR tone I sometimes heard from patients who'd gotten used to giving the acceptable version of their experience. He talked about the specifics, the things that genuinely made him angry, the things that had surprised him by bothering him less than expected, the strange grief of losing an identity that had been almost entirely constructed around capability. I talked about my family, about Lily's nursing school acceptance and how proud I was, and how terrifying the tuition numbers were. About my mom, who'd worked grocery retail for 11 years and still somehow managed to have dinner made when she got home at midnight. About why I'd gone into physical therapy, which was partly practical and partly because our family doctor had missed my dad's early Parkinson's symptoms for 2 years before it was finally caught. And I wanted to be someone who looked carefully. We went back the next week, and the week after. It wasn't linear. I want to be honest about that because the easy version of this story would smooth over the parts that weren't easy, and I don't think that serves anyone. There were days Elliot canceled. Not often, but sometimes. There were days he came and was quiet, and seemed like he was somewhere behind glass. Present but unreachable. I learned not to push on those days. I learned to just be there and talk about low-stakes things and let the quieter version of the conversation be enough. I had a patient at the clinic, a 58-year-old man named, and I'll call him by his first name only here, a man named Carl who had a similar quality after his stroke. Some days he was sharp and engaged. Some days he was somewhere far inside himself, and the best thing you could do was just keep showing up. I'd learned that from Carl. Elliot reminded me of it from a different angle. There was an afternoon in late March when Elliot told me he'd turned down a position consulting on medical device accessibility policy for a healthcare nonprofit. He'd been offered it twice. He'd said no both times. When I asked why, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because every time I imagine doing it, I imagine being paraded around as the inspiration guy, the before and after doctor in the chair, and I can't figure out how to be useful without being a symbol." I didn't have a neat answer for that. I told him what I actually thought, which was that he was probably right to be suspicious of organizations that led with the symbol, but that the work itself wasn't the symbol, that the actual policy gap he was describing, how medical devices were designed and tested without meaningful input from people who actually used them, was real and important, and his particular combination of clinical background and lived experience was genuinely rare, that he could define the terms of how he engaged, that it didn't have to look like what he was afraid it would look like. He didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window for a while. 2 weeks later, he told me he'd called the nonprofit back. Somewhere in there, things shifted in a way that I hadn't anticipated, and I think he hadn't either. The coffee meeting started running longer. We started going to other places. A natural history museum on a Tuesday afternoon when it was empty. A bookstore on Hennepin that had an elevator that worked about 70% of the time, which became a reliable source of dark humor. He started asking about specific patients I worked with, not by name but by situation, asking good clinical questions, the kind a physician asks, not the kind a sympathetic outsider asks. I started talking to him about cases I was stuck on, not for advice exactly, but because talking through things out loud with someone who understood the medical context made me sharper. I don't know at what point we stopped being two people who had coffee sometimes and became something that mattered to both of us. There wasn't a specific moment. It accumulated. Raymond called me in April, not to check on Elliot, to ask how I was doing. I thought that was interesting. I told him honestly that I was doing well, and that his son was one of the most interesting people I'd met in a long time. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he started sleeping again. He said it the way parents say things about their kids when they've been scared for a long time and the fear is just beginning to release. Carefully, like they don't want to jinx it. I understood. The policy consulting work started in May. Elliot took it on his terms. He was clear up front that he wasn't there to be a spokesperson, that his role was to review clinical trial design and testing protocols, to flag the gaps between what device manufacturers assumed about users and what users actually experienced. He was meticulous about it. He sent me a 17-page document in June that outlined accessibility shortcomings in a commonly used rehabilitation monitoring device and the specific patient populations most affected. He asked me to review it for accuracy from a PT standpoint. It was one of the most rigorous pieces of clinical writing I'd read that year. I told him so. He said, I need it to be better than the clinical writing I'd have done in the ER. I don't have the luxury of being the guy who got the benefit of the doubt anymore. That sentence stayed with me. The hospital did a feature on the policy work in August, a small piece in their internal newsletter, nothing major. Someone forwarded it to a regional health publication, and they ran a brief article about the initiative. In the content section online, there were a handful of responses that were unkind, not vicious, but the low-level dismissiveness that comes so easily in comment sections. People questioning whether someone with a physical disability could meaningfully evaluate medical device design, as if the lived experience of using a device was somehow less relevant than designing one from behind a desk. I saw the comments before Elliot did, and I almost didn't tell him. Then I decided not to manage his experience for him, which felt important. He read them. He was quiet. Then he said, "These are the exact people my report is about." That's almost funny. It wasn't quite a joke, but it was close. And close felt like something. By autumn, the initiative had expanded. 2 additional medical device companies had requested review partnerships. A medical school in the Twin Cities had reached out about incorporating the framework into their curriculum. Elliot was doing work that was genuinely consequential, that was changing the way devices were evaluated before they reached patients, and he was doing it as himself. Not as a symbol, not as an inspiration piece, but as a physician with a specific set of clinical and experiential knowledge that happened to be rare. He gave a lecture at the medical school in October. It was the first time he'd spoken publicly in front of a medical audience since before the accident. He told me the night before that he was going to cancel, that he'd changed his mind, that the whole thing was a mistake. I sat on the phone with him for an hour and a half while he talked himself into and out of it about 6 times. I didn't try to convince him, I just stayed on the line. Somewhere around midnight okay, I'm doing it, I wasn't there for the lecture, I had patience. But he texted me afterward. I didn't die. I laughed out loud alone in my car in the clinic parking lot. That was the moment I knew we were going to be okay. Not because the lecture had gone perfectly, not because everything was resolved, but because he'd used the word die as a joke, lightly, without weight. Because the fear had gotten small enough to make fun of. We went back to the fundraiser luncheon in November, the same event, the same venue, the Hargrove Medical Center quarterly gala. Hargrove had invited Elliot as a featured speaker to discuss the policy initiative. He'd said yes. I was there in a different capacity that time, not rented vest, not water tray. Elliot had asked if I wanted to come as his guest, and I'd said yes before he finished the sentence. The room was the same. The chandeliers were the same. The careful small talk of important people was the same. But when Elliot came through the door this time, it was different. Not because the room parted for him. It didn't, not exactly. But because he moved through it differently. He wasn't tucked into a corner by the windows. He stopped and talked to people, introduced himself, shook hands. Some of the interactions were awkward in the normal human ways that interactions are sometimes awkward. A few people didn't quite know what to do with the silence between words, but he moved through it without flinching. Without the resignation I'd seen in his face the first time, he gave his remarks from the front of the room. He talked about the initiative, about what was wrong with the way the medical device industry designed for hypothetical users instead of actual ones, about the cost of that gap in real patient outcomes. He was clear and specific and occasionally sharp in a way that made a few of the suits in the room shift slightly in their seats, which I privately enjoyed. Afterward, during the mingling, I found him near the windows, same windows, and he looked out at the parking garage and then looked back at me and said, "The river view really is better." I said I'd told him so. He said, "The night I met you, I had talked myself into going home after 40 minutes. I was counting down to it. And then this PT aide in a vest that didn't fit him came and started talking about the Mississippi, and I stayed for the whole thing." He paused. "I don't know if I ever told you that." He hadn't. "You stopped," he said. "That's the whole thing. You just stopped." I didn't say anything for a moment. The room moved around us, glasses clinking, that layered murmur of 200 conversations happening simultaneously. "Anyone would have," I said. He looked at me steadily. "No," he said. "They wouldn't. That's the part you still don't understand." I've thought about that a lot since then, about what it means to stop, about how much of our social world runs on the fuel of momentum, keeping moving, staying with the comfortable clusters, avoiding the corners where the geometry has gotten complicated, about how easy it is to convince yourself that not stopping is neutral, that it's just how things go, that someone else will stop. Nobody stops unless somebody decides to stop. My sister Lily started her nursing program that fall semester. Our mom came to the orientation with her and sent me a photo. Lily in a white coat that was too big, grinning like she'd gotten away with something. I put it on the corkboard above my desk at the clinic. Raymond Foresight, in one of the quieter and more significant gestures of that year, established a scholarship fund through Hargrove Medical Center for physical therapy and occupational therapy students from working-class families in the Twin Cities metro area. He didn't make a big announcement about it. He called me and told me about it the same way he'd told me Elliot was sleeping again, carefully, without making it more than it was. I asked him why he was telling me first. He said, "Because Elliot told me to. There's something I've been trying to figure out how to say, and I'm going to try to say it plainly. What happened between me and Elliot didn't start as anything other than a conversation. I wasn't trying to do something meaningful. I was trying to refill water glasses without spilling anything on a senator. I stopped because something in his face looked like something I recognized, and I didn't have a good enough reason not to stop. That's the whole origin story. There's no more dramatic version of it. But here's what I've come to understand from the year that followed. The people who are tucked into corners at the edges of rooms are often the ones carrying the most. Not always, but often. The ones the social geometry has quietly rearranged itself around. The ones who've stopped expecting anyone to close the distance. And the distance isn't always physical. It's sometimes the distance between what someone shows and what someone is. It's sometimes the distance between what a person could contribute and what they're being allowed to. Elliot once told me, on one of those long coffee afternoons, that the hardest part wasn't the physical adaptation, as enormous as that was. The hardest part was recalibrating his sense of what he was allowed to expect from the world, what he was allowed to want, what he was allowed to be. He said, "You have to unlearn a certain kind of smallness, and you can't do it alone." He was right. You can't do it alone, which means that what you do or don't do when you're standing 6 feet from someone who is alone in a full room actually matters, not in an abstract inspirational post way, in a specific measurable this person's life way. I think about that every time I'm tempted to keep moving. Before I go, I want to ask you something. If this story connected with you, or if you know someone who is stuck in a corner to us, literally or otherwise, comment the word "seen" below, because that's what it's really about, being seen. Not fixed, not rescued, not made into a symbol of anything, just seen. Elliot would say the river view is better from the 4th floor, and he's right. But I'll tell you what I think is actually better. The view from a room where nobody has to sit alone in the corner anymore, where the geometry has been rearranged on purpose, for once, by someone who decided to stop. That's what I learned from a rented vest and a parking garage view and a 12-minute conversation about a river I've seen 100 times and somehow never really looked at until someone made me describe it.